In the last video, I was saying that even though it sounds ridiculous, it looks like MAGA and ICE are producing the effect of having to create a new buffer zone in the western side of the US due to the new working relationship between capitalist and communist nations. As the Democrats have been bringing progress on an international level into the USA, it has caused a crisis in its constitution over the way progress is created and the freedom to create and own wealth. Whereas previously, having Japan in the US orbit was enough to shield US politics from the influence of communism across the Pacific. And freedom was the motto of the West Coast, especially in places like California and Las Vegas. But the rise of China has meant that its influence is coming across much stronger. And there has been a major shift since the Soviet Union influence in Europe was the main concern in the West. But it is not just because their relationship has changed across the Pacific. The way that society has worked has changed too, because of the rise of people politics. Whereas during the Cold War, there was an antagonistic relationship between the two sides, as the primary mission of communism was to create a firm basis to export the revolution, which meant both sides were more exclusionist. That is, sticking together with NATO on one side and the Warsaw Pact on the other, representing their commitment to military alliances which kept the balance of power. It was the focus of political speeches and the creation of leadership, which is why the Cuban Missile Crisis was the turning point in the Cold War, as after that it became apparent neither side could win, and this led to the need to resolve the fundamental issue which caused the Iron Curtain to fall. After the subsequent rise of a more friendly type of people politics coming from China and the rise of its global influence, a very antisocial element emerged when the right wing of politics in both the US and across Europe, as the capitalists found this to be a growing threat to their control over private wealth, social institutions, and individual freedom, and the racist element as a threat to the control of their borders, as it used reasoning and compassion to address human issues, pushing the idea of extreme private wealth and control of the state by a very few rich individuals back into a crisis. And now there is widespread calls for change across societies worldwide. This has led to the rise of an anti-immigration view that minority groups cause poverty, social problems, and there have been increasing attacks, both verbal and physical, on groups of all kinds which are not aligned with this idea. It seems now that only as the Epstein files are being released that people are starting to see the problem with what was being done with that sort of freedom. And the buying and selling of humans as a resource was rife. So now these issues are coming out into the open. Governments have been addressing the rights of different types of people, and underprivileged areas are receiving more attention due to the need to bring a sense of order to the situation. Hence, there is a new type of game being played in global politics, in that the new working relationship between the superpowers must logically develop into a resolution between the deep divides in geopolitics. Government analysts must hence pave the way for how we can get there in terms of where the situation can go next. And this looks why it's acceptable to the Trump administration to employ people with far-right tendencies in ICE, as long as the rise of people's politics continues to rise to counterbalance it. So I think it is a massive failure on the part of the left not to move forward in terms of encouraging people to become aware of actually what is happening and get a proper education with the full history, rather than just simply follow along the situation just in an opposite way to the right in the name of counterbalancing, and instead installing the real values which were proposed by the revolutionaries in France and the revolutionaries in Russia, which was to create a properly educated society which could think for itself, instead of being controlled and manipulated by an upper social class. And I must say that is one of the ideas on the left which I agree with. I agree with the right-wing idea of having a good sense of structure and discipline, and not just railing against the system, but to create a proper organized plan and I think we should use elements of both right and left if we have a brain in our heads, and discuss a shared response across the whole of government and security services in order to find the right sort of responses, not just the reactionary responses to each other's activities and the problems that they're giving us. So, even though certain people do actually need prosecuting, meanwhile, things are going back to suggesting that people organising the left have this kind of personal connection with communism, whereas this is not true in most cases, although there is the element there, like there is a connection with the fascists on the right somewhere, I don't exactly know where it is. Whereas instead, we should be moving the situation forward to explaining how it's all about the world order, so people can correctly identify and deconstruct dysfunctional ideas and replace them with working ones, not in a Hegelian dialectical or Marxist dialectical sense, but just because it's the right thing to do at the time. Again, in line with the way government policies function and progress, so people can show you why they acted like they did, while the irrational elements of the administration cannot. This has its historical roots in every successful protest, as it can show why it's correct, while the authorities cannot explain themselves. In the USA, for example, the inequalities of free market capitalism have created a situation in which illegal immigration has become a thing, because of the accumulation of wealth in developed nations combined with the need for people to find employment. It's a political weapon the left can use against the right in Western governments, and there are armed gangs roaming the streets with revolutionary philosophies. I've seen them in the UK and on social media in countries around the world. And I'm not denying the fact that certain rap bands are targeted towards mainstream society and the police, putting forward first-hand accounts of the levels of crime on state-funded housing estates. But this just directs Western societies even more against socialist policies and encourages the denigration of people who believe in left-wing ideas. Hence the US government's perceived public support for ICE. It's really about the effects of the divides in geopolitics on economics. But racism has become the focus of criticism and progress alike. Due to a failure from the left to stretch and challenge the explanation of events and thinking on the issue, and the right being reluctant to say anything, meaning that people will just move on to the next crisis in the same way that they moved from Gaza into this one, with no real improvement having been made in terms of what they're achieving. That is the quality of ideas. That is the it's like just a kind of one mob against another, isn't it, really? And it's just in proportion, according to the revolution, the proportion of the problem is the exploitation, so the proportion of the solution needs to be the people's push forward. And it's just become the new way that progress occurs, until the problem literally becomes terrorism, and the world is literally just shocked that it hasn't done anything about it, and yet also the fact that it's happening. So the problem is really that there must be rules to the situation, even as it changes over time, which is why ideas like fascism and communism arose in the 20th century in the first place, to fill the power vacuum that the European monarchies left when they collapsed after World War One. Even illegal organizations must have some kind of aims and codes of behavior, or they simply would not be able to exist. So we have to really ask the question, what enables their existence? What allows it? What justifies it? How do they justify themselves? And what could society do to incorporate people? Which is the problem, really, is that when people have become so excluded that they end up having to fend for themselves, and it creates their own traditions and it creates their own ways of life, which then come into conflict, obviously, with the government, exactly as they were possibly expected to. But governments get so deranged over people criticizing them, they use violent crackdowns like ICE and recently in Iran. And isn't it a bit suspicious how they're both happening at the same time, but just in two opposite ways? the Iranian government are quashing the pro-freedom protesters, and the US government is quashing the socialism protesters. So this is because how everything's happening in the world is all interlinked in terms of the way that government works. And when it creates success, it looks great, but when systems fail, it looks like this. Still, while the US, Venezuela, Ukraine, and various other nations are in crisis, we are making progress in the Uzbekistan arts community. We have seen a lot of upstanding people protesting on social media, protesting videos, protesting in the streets of Minnesota and Iran, reacting to the government's use of blatant fascism on one side or socialism on the other, which is essentially what this is. However, the public are more concerned with social equality and the well-being of citizens, so they're reacting in a totally different way to the way that government sees the problem. The two sides thus become essentially at odds with each other, and we can never solve the problem, as the issue which caused this is entirely buried under the chaos caused by the way that events have occurred and buried under the new world order that we created since we established the foundation for this situation yesterday. It's imagine in the future people say, I don't need your world order issues right now. Just like today, people say, I don't need your toxic behavior right now. As over time, new ideas become canonical and we can see how the world has moved forward in this way. So I think it's safe to say that we can play around with questioning the idea of how the world works, as long as we know the difference between the ideal and the actual. In this way, we can conceive, create, formulate, and express our new ideas. And it's something the media has done extensively, especially in fiction, books, and movie studios, which have explored the idea of our present time through the creation of alternative realities, satire, parody, and our present time through the creation of projections into the future based on directions which exist within the present. These can be used to highlight issues with current society which people are having a problem with expressing because of how the current world works. George Orwell's novel about a dystopian future society, written in the early 20th century about the year 1984, has been mentioned a lot on social media recently, especially the Ministry of Truth's final command to only believe what they say and not what you see and hear, a reference to Washington's response to ICE agents shooting civilians in Minnesota. Anyway, there's plenty of video footage on the internet, so decide for yourself. As I said a while back, the more the world solves the problem over time, the less incentive there is for the UN, and we can see the proportions in which the ages change from the way the UN system could barely cope with the two sides in the early Cold War, which caused the Cuban Missile Crisis, and after that we can see that we had the situation basically under control, so that being the second half of the postmodern age, now we must call this the early Anthropocene because it is the period which comes after that. So we're creating, but not entirely living, in the way that humanity is actually getting on top of the situation. Yet, it is still happening that people in central government have their head in the clouds, in the sense that they believe that they can continue to define their own importance solely on the way in which that they are working with the UN to solve your small national problems. And their greatnesses are working with this high level and this mysterious way. And I'll tell you, we're over the line now. So we need people to call them out on this. We need to see basically that we should be getting on top of the situation now in real terms, and that is the output of the problems of this phase, is however it is happening. We know that if the shape of global civilization caused the problem that we have now, then it comes to the point where it doesn't matter anymore how it happened, but just that it is happening, that we're having a problem right now. So the billionaires and other people who understand the world order situation are operating in their world of cryptocurrency, with level 7 people working for them who know all this stuff that I've been saying here. They know how the world works, and it's their job to lay in the new components of the real world which we live in as they plan investments and build factories to make the new technologies. In this sense, I have learned that level 7s really should be, instead of completely doing their own thing, learn to work with the level 8s who are concerned with the strategic planning of organizations and end up building rather than competing against each other. So maybe this is just the corruption in the system that causes all the problems. It's just that people do actually want to work together instead of fight against each other. And it's the shape of the situation actually which needs addressing at some other level, I think, like the UN. So it's not only important, but it's essential that people think about the way that the world works, as the social cause of straight up exploitation is when one part of the human population is convinced that they're superior to another in a general sense. It happened with the kings and queens of Europe, with the emperors of China, and it's the problem that came out of the ancient world, leading to Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, and Hitler. Even though they thought that they had something better, they killed millions of people and did not solve the problem, because the problem is the world order itself. We know we can't go back in time and solve the problem from there, nor can we stop people from being better at some things than others. So we know that we're always going to have wealth inequality. But we can solve the problem of the exploitation and the cruelty, and even though education systems were designed to produce factory workers and colleges to create specialists in their fields, if we can engineer situations and use social systems to regulate their own behavior, perhaps the biggest advantage that people have, if they understand the big picture, is that they can see how to maneuver in relation to it, and they can get promoted up the levels, whereas people who can't get trapped in the low levels, have poor vision, low intensity courses of action, and trapped in the local paradigm on the kind of folklore kind of level. A book that I recommend actually is ET 101, which is a satirical handbook for the mission to the dysfunctional planet Earth. It says even experienced veterans of missions to dysfunctional planets should watch out for this one. In the next video, I'll be looking more for answers to today's questions. In the meantime, please like, subscribe, and share to this channel for further updates. And if you can, please support this channel, because it is very difficult to make these videos. They take weeks to prepare. I have to study a lot of layers of society. I meet lots of weirdos. I get nearly into trouble with government officials everywhere I go. And it would be nice to have a cup of coffee and maybe have a chat with somebody sometime. Thank you for listening.